They closed an event that had been running for 30 years. An expo in Lakeland, Florida that catered to Canadian snowbirds, an annual tradition since 1995. Just gone, not postponed, not scaled back, canceled entirely because the customers stopped coming. And here's the part that should terrify anyone paying attention. This wasn't about affordability or airline schedules or pandemic hangover. The Canadians who used to fill those Florida hotels made a choice. They decided their money was better spent anywhere else. $5.7 billion. That's what the U.S. Travel Association says the American tourism industry lost in 2025 from Canadian visitors pulling back. And the truly wild part? Early data from 2026 shows the decline is accelerating. This is not a blip. This is not seasonal noise. This is the largest sustained pullback from a single country in the modern history of U.S. tourism. And while American political coverage treats this like a footnote, the people whose livelihoods depend on cross-border travel are watching their world collapse in real time. Before all of this started, Canada was the single largest source of international visitors to the United States. Not second place, not close behind, first. Over 20 million Canadians made trips to the U.S. in 2024 alone, spending roughly $20.5 billion. That spending directly supported an estimated 140,000 American jobs. Not abstract jobs in finance towers or tech campuses. Real jobs in hotels, restaurants, rental car counters, theme parks, souvenir shops. The most labor-intensive, paycheck-to-paycheck corners of the American economy. The kind of jobs where a 20% revenue drop doesn't mean delayed bonuses. It means pink slips. Statistics Canada data shows Canadian return trips from the U.S. fell 22% in January 2026 compared to January 2025, and January 2025 was already way down from 2024. That January figure marked the 13th consecutive month of year-over-year declines, 13 in a row. February 2026 didn't break the streak. It confirmed it, posting a 14.5% year-over-year drop and hitting a new record low for cross-border travel. When you see a pattern like that sustained over more than a year with no signs of reversal, you stop calling it sentiment and start calling it structural. Here's what people miss when they look at those numbers in isolation. This is not a currency fluctuation. It's not post-pandemic adjustment. It's not even about gas prices or flight costs. This is a deliberate behavioral shift by millions of individual Canadians who made a conscious decision to spend their vacation dollars somewhere else. Surveys conducted by Laguerre and Longwoods International found that between 59 and 62% of Canadians say U.S. government policies and political rhetoric now make them significantly less likely to visit. That number has stayed rock stable across multiple polling firms for over a year. When you see that kind of consistency across independent surveys, you're not measuring a mood, you're measuring a reset. For decades, U.S.-Canada cross-border travel functioned almost like an internal market. The proximity, the shared language, the open roads. Canadians crossed into the U.S. the way you drive to another city. It wasn't even considered international travel in the way a trip to Europe would be. The Auto Pact of the 1960s integrated manufacturing economies. The original free trade agreements of the late 80s integrated goods markets. All of that was underpinned by a tourism relationship that was, until recently, essentially frictionless. What's happening now is a rupture of something that was never supposed to be fragile. When you impose 25% tariffs on a neighbor, publicly speculate about annexing their country, and then watch them react not just politically, but personally with their wallets, their vacation choices, their airline bookings, you are watching a relationship reset in real time. And the data says that reset is not temporary. It is becoming the new baseline. The muscle memory of choosing Orlando over Cancun, of booking Vegas instead of Montreal, is being overridden. And once that rewiring happens at the level of individual habit and preference, reversing it takes years, not news cycles. Now here's the piece that changes the entire framing of this story. While all of this is happening to American tourism, Canada's own tourism sector is booming. Destination Canada, in its official 2026 to 2035 tourism outlook published just last month, projects that visitor spending in Canada will hit $140.9 billion in 2026, up 6% from 2025. The sector is growing faster than the broader Canadian economy. 1 in 10 Canadian jobs is now supported by tourism, injecting more than $364 million daily into communities across the country. The same trade pressure draining billions out of American tourism is funneling money into Canadian destinations, Mexican resorts, and European capitals. And here's something that rarely gets mentioned alongside the boycott story. Canada is not just benefiting from Canadians staying home. International visitors are actively choosing Canada in larger numbers. The UK, Europe, and Asia-Pacific markets are all showing growth in inbound Canadian tourism. The country ranked first in Reputation's 2026 Global Reputation Index, a soft power dividend that is translating directly into visitor arrivals. While the US is managing a reputational erosion that is showing up in travel data, Canada is collecting the upside of that shift. This is not a zero-sum story where both countries hurt equally. One side is bleeding, the other is redirecting the flow. Let's talk about where the American pain is actually landing, because it is not evenly distributed. And that uneven distribution is what makes this politically explosive in ways most coverage is missing entirely. Start with Las Vegas. In 2024, roughly 1.4 million Canadians visited the city. That made Canada one of the most important international feeder markets for the Las Vegas Strip, not just in headcount but in spending. Canadians who fly to Vegas are not budget travelers. They're booking shows, staying in mid to high-end hotels, gambling, eating in nice restaurants. They're exactly the kind of visitor that keeps service sector wages stable and hotel occupancy rates healthy. By 2025, that number had dropped by roughly 20%. Airline capacity between Canada and Las Vegas is down approximately 35%, the lowest level since 2006. According to FTI Consulting's analysis, Las Vegas finished 2025 with a 7.5% year-over-year drop in total visitor volume, its lowest annual total since 2010 outside of the COVID years. That is not a minor fluctuation. That is a city-level crisis for one of the most tourism-dependent economies in America. Las Vegas tourism officials got desperate enough that they traveled to Vancouver twice, once in August 2025 and again in early 2026, specifically to try to win Canadians back. 3 resorts eventually reported a slight uptick after launching targeted Canadian marketing campaigns. But read that for what it is. One of the most famous tourist destinations on Earth had to mount a foreign marketing operation to recover business it had always taken for granted. Now Florida. Air Transat, a major Canadian carrier, announced it is ending all U.S. flights by June 2026. Not reducing, ending. The carrier cited sustained low demand. The city of Lakeland in central Florida was forced to cancel its Snowbird Extravaganza, that annual expo event running since 1995 that catered specifically to Canadian winter visitors. Gone. The event that had run for 30 years, built around the reliable annual flow of Canadians seeking sun, simply couldn't sustain itself anymore. That's not a statistic. That is a community that lost something real, a tradition, an economic anchor, a piece of its identity. OAG aviation data confirms the broader picture. Major carriers cut nearly 450,000 seats from Canada-US schedules in the first part of 2026 alone. That is a 10.1% overall reduction in capacity. WestJet cut U.S. capacity by 19%. Flair Airlines, which had been aggressively expanding U.S. routes, slashed its U.S.-bound capacity by 58%. Air Canada trimmed by 7%. Airlines don't cut seats because of sentiment. They cut seats because they can't fill them. When you see 3 major carriers pulling back simultaneously, you are watching an industry respond to demand destruction, not just a news cycle. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about how this is playing out strategically. What Canada's government seems to have understood, and this is worth paying attention to, is that Canadian consumer behavior is itself a form of leverage. The federal government did not organize a boycott. It did not instruct Canadians where to vacation. What it did was maintain a firm posture on tariffs, declined to soften its rhetoric in ways that might have reassured a nervous public, and let the natural consequence of bruised national pride flow into the economy. The result is that 62% of Canadians are now autonomously applying economic pressure on the U.S. service sector, pressure that no tariff retaliation could replicate with the same surgical precision. When Canada retaliates on steel or aluminum, the pain is concentrated in specific industries and specific regions. When Canadians stop vacationing in Florida, the pain spreads across every hotel, restaurant, rental car counter, and theme park ticket booth from Miami to Orlando. It hits the shuttle driver, the laundry service, the gift shop owner. The tourism sector is one of the fastest employment multipliers in any economy. $1 spent at a hotel doesn't stay at the hotel. It flows to the restaurant across the street, the local tour guide, the souvenir stand. When that dollar stops arriving, the contraction is not linear, it cascades. And here's what nobody's talking about in the U.S. political coverage of this story. The communities taking the hardest hits from the Canadian tourism collapse are not liberal coastal cities. They are border communities in Michigan, New York, and Vermont, many of them in counties that voted for the current administration. The western New York area around Niagara Falls alone has seen a net decline of roughly 3.6 million fewer Canadian crossings compared to previous periods. Those are dollars that used to flow into local businesses, restaurants, and shops owned by American small business owners. The math doesn't ask about party affiliation before it starts cutting into revenue. What the data is showing is that the cascade has been running for over a year in communities that had no part in the policy decisions that triggered it. That is the human cost underneath the headline number. And it is the piece of this story that deserves far more attention than it is getting. Border town mayors are not holding press conferences blaming Ottawa. They're quietly cutting municipal budgets, delaying infrastructure projects, and watching Main Street storefronts go dark. The political theater happens in Washington and Ottawa. The economic consequences land on people who never asked to be part of the fight. Now here's where this story shifts from damage report to strategic realignment. While American tourism markets are contracting under the weight of the Canadian boycott, Canadian spending hasn't disappeared. It has been redirected, and where it went tells you everything about the durability of this shift. Toronto to Cancun is now Mexico's busiest international route. Read that again. A Canadian city to a Mexican resort city is now Mexico's single highest traffic international flight corridor. Canada to Mexico flights were up 15.7% year over year. WestJet now holds 52% of all Canada-Mexico flights for the winter season. That is not incidental. That is a market reorientation at scale. Airbnb's data for Canadian travelers shows a near double-digit increase in international bookings to destinations outside the United States, compared to the first half of 2024. Their trending destination list for Canadians now includes Tokyo, Rio de Janeiro, Paris, Casablanca, and Los Cabos. Visits from Canadians to the United Kingdom surged 14% in a recent month. Mexico saw 22% growth. China posted an 11% year-over-year gain. Domestic tourism searches inside Canada surged nearly 20%, with 64% of Canadians in a national survey saying they planned a vacation within the country this year. Banff, Jasper, Vancouver, and Nova Scotia are reporting record visitor numbers. This is where the international comparison becomes instructive. Think about what Mexico did when it faced sustained trade pressure from the United States around 2018. Rather than matching every U.S. action with a symmetric response, Mexico accelerated trade and travel agreements with the European Union and Asia-Pacific markets, effectively reducing its dependence on a single economic relationship over a 5-year window. The result was that when the next round of friction hit, Mexico had diversified enough to have real options. Canada today appears to be following a version of that playbook, but not just in goods trade. It's happening in tourism flows, in airline routes, in vacation spending. The Canadian consumer is involuntarily, or deliberately, doing what trade negotiators spend years trying to engineer, reducing single point of failure exposure to one market. In fairness, there is a counter-argument worth acknowledging. Some U.S. tourism officials point out that American visitors to Canada actually rose 6.1% in February 2026, the first year-over-year increase after 12 consecutive months of decline. And they're right to note it. Americans have continued traveling north, apparently undeterred by the political climate. That asymmetry is real. Americans are voting with their feet in a direction opposite to their government's stated posture. But even granting that data point its full weight, the arithmetic still doesn't close. Canada was sending over 20 million visitors a year to the U.S. The U.S. sends roughly 12 to 13 million to Canada. The gap in volume means Canadian withdrawal hurts American tourism far more than any equivalent American pullback would hurt Canada's. The scale asymmetry runs in Canada's favor. What I keep coming back to is RBC Economics finding that Canadian domestic tourism GDP grew at an annualized rate of 4.8% in the fourth quarter of 2025, even as the broader Canadian economy faced headwinds from the same tariff environment. That is a remarkable data point. It suggests that the spending Canadians are redirecting away from U.S. destinations is not being saved or suppressed. It is being injected into the Canadian economy. Every dollar that used to go to a Las Vegas hotel or a Florida theme park and is now going to a Banff resort or a Nova Scotia bed and breakfast is a dollar that generates Canadian employment, Canadian tax revenue, and Canadian GDP. The trade war meant to pressure Canada is at the consumer level, partially functioning as an inadvertent stimulus package for the Canadian tourism sector. And here's where the bigger picture comes into focus. Destination Canada projects that by 2035, total tourism revenue in Canada will reach $216.3 billion, 67% higher than 2024 levels. The overseas market is forecast to grow at 9.8% annually over the next decade, nearly double the U.S. pace. Tourism is now projected to contribute up to $30 billion toward Canada's goal of securing $300 billion in additional non-U.S. exports by 2035. The boycott that started as emotional backlash is quietly getting woven into a structural diversification story that goes well beyond vacation planning. Now here's the thing about structural shifts, and this is important context. Once airlines retire routes and redeploy aircraft to more profitable corridors, those routes don't automatically come back when the political mood changes. Air Transat ending all U.S. flights by June 2026 is not a pause. That is a corporate bet that Canadian to U.S. demand will not recover quickly enough to justify the operational cost. And when one carrier makes that call, it forces competitors to recalculate too. The aviation market is a leading indicator, and right now it is telling us that the people who fly actual planes for a living do not believe this recovers fast. Let me bring this back to the number we started with. $5.7 billion. That was 2025. Now look at the trajectory. January 2026 was down 22% year over year. February 2026 was down 14.5% and hit a new record low. The boycott is not winding down. A tourism consultancy cited by multiple sources told Forbes that it isn't going away quickly. That assessment was made in March 2026, and nothing in the April or May data has contradicted it. The U.S. Travel Association actually projected that 2026 would be a rebound year for international tourism, built on the assumption that the FIFA World Cup, co-hosted by the US, Canada, and Mexico, would generate massive cross-border travel and reverse the downward trend. But that thesis has already run into complications. Multiple nations have issued travel advisories for the United States ahead of the tournament. And the political climate that drove Canadians away from US vacations is the same political climate shaping those advisories. The event that was supposed to heal the tourism wound may end up taking place against a backdrop of sustained wariness. The World Travel and Tourism Council estimates that broader international travel slowdowns could result in $12.5 billion in total lost visitor spending in the United States. When you add Canadian behavioral data to European hesitation, surveys suggest European travel intentions toward the US are also softening. The US faces a compounding problem that goes beyond any single bilateral relationship. The Canadian boycott opened a door. Other countries are watching to see whether walking through it carries any cost. So far, from an economic standpoint, the answer appears to be not much. And that perception matters for how this resolves. This is where it hits your wallet directly, whether you're in Canada or watching from the US side. The 140,000 American jobs that depended on Canadian tourist spending are concentrated in hospitality and food service, sectors that pay median or below median wages and have very little cushion against sustained revenue drops. When those jobs contract, the pain doesn't stay in Las Vegas or Orlando. It ripples into the local housing market, local tax bases, school budgets, and municipal services. Small businesses in border communities in Vermont, Michigan, and New York are already reporting 4 to 6% workforce contractions. That is families making different decisions about spending, saving, and planning their own futures. On the Canadian side, the picture is more complicated than a simple win. Canadian travelers who used to fly to Florida in February for $300 are now booking Mexico, Portugal, or a ski lodge in Quebec. And not all of those alternatives are cheaper or more convenient. Some Canadians are absorbing real costs in the name of principle. The economic stimulus effect for Canadian domestic tourism is real, but it doesn't fully compensate every individual household that would have preferred a direct flight to Miami. This is worth being honest about. The cost of this trade dispute is not landing where it was designed to land. Tariffs on Canadian steel were supposed to pressure Canadian manufacturers. Tariffs on Canadian autos were supposed to realign production toward American soil. But the downstream behavioral response, Canadians redirecting their consumer spending, their vacation dollars, their airline bookings, is applying pressure to American service workers who had nothing to do with the trade policy debate. That gap between who the policy targeted and who is actually absorbing the consequences is the central economic irony of this entire story. The architects of the tariff strategy are insulated. The hotel housekeeper in Orlando is not. Where does this go from here? The honest answer is that no one is certain, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. What the data does suggest is that a behavioral shift of this scale, sustained over more than a year with structural reinforcement from airline route cuts and the retirement of entire product offerings like Air Transit's U.S. network, is not reversed in a single news cycle or even a single trade agreement. The muscle memory of choosing Mexico over Miami, of booking Banff instead of Boca Raton, takes time to unwind even after the political conditions change. RBC's economists are already flagging that Canadian domestic tourism GDP growth is becoming a structural feature of the economic landscape, not a temporary substitution effect. For the U.S. tourism industry, the honest reckoning is this. The most valuable international customer it ever had, 20 million visitors, $20.5 billion in spending, 140,000 supported jobs, did not leave because of a competitor offering a better product. They left because of a policy choice. That is recoverable in ways that a market-driven loss would not be. But recovery requires the political conditions to change first. And right now, those conditions are still pointing in the wrong direction. The rhetoric has not softened. The tariffs have not been lifted. And the surveys show Canadian sentiment has not budged. Here's what I keep coming back to, and I want to know if you feel the same way. Somewhere in the gap between a tariff announcement in Washington and a canceled Las Vegas hotel booking in Vancouver, something shifted in the relationship between these two countries. Not just in trade data or airline capacity reports. In how Canadians actually think about the United States as a place. The question I can't stop thinking about is this. Once that shift happens at the level of individual attitude and habit, once the mental map of where you vacation gets redrawn, is it truly reversible? Or are we watching something more permanent take hold? A reset that outlasts the politicians who triggered it and reshapes the economic geography of North America for a generation.